What's going on? Hey, how are you? Hopefully, I'm not seeing you there yet, Mara, but hopefully you'll pop up.
Okay, I am here on my video, but I don't know how to make me pop up on yours.
I'm gonna try to find you.
I might be buried.
What is that?
I might be buried in the pictures.
Okay, that's all right. I'm gonna hopefully my computer is being slow as a heads up too, which if there's anything in parks, we all know it's you just got to be flexible and go with it. So that is what we are going to do if I have any tech issues. All right. Somebody else sees Mara. Let's see here. If there's a way, cool, there's awesome. Yeah. Okay. I think I can almost, we can probably pin you, Mara.
Yeah, I just pinned her, Agnes.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah.
Great. Cool. All right. People are seeing her. And again, I apologize. My computer's being super slow. So I hope there's not any delays on things.
We good to start?
Yeah. Mara, great
Excellent.
to see you.
Well, welcome everyone. This session is titled Equity in the Parks, and it's going to be presented by Agnes Barslow and Mara Iverson. My name is Ryan Heck, and I'll be the moderator. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to add them into the chat. And just make sure that your microphones are muted because it tends to pick up a lot of the ambient noise around you guys. Just to ensure engagement, make sure that we keep the cameras on throughout the training. And like I said, we'll be using the chat as a Q&A function. And I may, as I see questions come up, I'll bring them up to the presenters. And just to give a little introduction to Agnes. Agnes started in the parks in '99. She's worked in all the regions in one capacity or other, whether it be a manager, attendant, innkeeper, supervisor, even a random toilet cleaner. She's had the role of operations manager in Region 3 for 3.5 years. And just recently, as of last week, transitioned into the operations manager for the Departments of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. So Agnes, I'll pass it off to you.
Sweet. Thank you. So I'm going to soon pass off the proverbial microphone over to Mara, which I'm super jazzed that Mara is here, which is awesome. So thanks everybody for being here. My name is Agnes Barslow. Last year, for those of you who attended training, we had Susanna Davis from the Office of Racial Equity join us, and it was an epic presentation. I am currently the one of the members of the Agency of Natural Resources, ANR. You'll hear that often. We have a DEI committee. I'm on the DEI committee, and I represent FPR, Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And so on the DEI committee, we work holistically across the agency to implement different layers of education, conversation, looking at policies. And it's a really wonderful group. And we luckily got to have Mara come in and give us a presentation, which was wonderful. And I also saw Mara present a couple years ago at the VRPA, which is the Vermont Parks and Recreation Association annual meeting. And I was bowled over by Mara's presentation because she's an amazing human being. And I've also seen her on the State House lawn giving presentations there. So I'm a little bit of a fan person for Mara, which is really great. So super psyched that Mara's going to be able to join us today. I'll launch off with Mara in a hot minute here, but I also mentioned I'm going to throw a bunch of things in the chat. There are resources that are important for everybody to know about in regards to the Agency of Natural Resources and Forest and Parks, Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation's commitment, an absolute true commitment to doing good work that promotes a welcoming, safe, and inclusive space for all of our volunteers, all of our staff, and all of our visitors as well too. So I'll put those resources in the chat. We can kind of, if we have time at the end, we can chat about them more. I'll be adding more layers into other meetings or other training sessions as well, kind of giving you some more info about our DEI work here within FPR. So I want to welcome you all, and especially Mara, who is an equity educator. And Mara is probably one of the most fun trainers I've seen. So I will turn it over to you and welcome, Mara.
Awesome. I'm really excited to be with all of you today. I inadvertently planned an outdoor day for myself today that wasn't related at all to what we were doing. But it reminded me how much I really appreciate opportunities to experience being outside in Vermont. I'm going to go do some waterfall exploring, like Warren, probably down in the, like, down to see Texas Falls, stuff like that. And it made me curious, like, oh, who takes care of this space? And it's national forest land, et cetera, et cetera. But that made me curious again about who does state park stuff, what is state park stuff, and who gets to take advantage of that space. So just really quickly, a little bit about me. My name is Mara Iverson. I use she, her pronouns. For a long time, I worked for an organization called Outright Vermont, if you're familiar. So they do work with LGBTQ plus youth. So for a long time, I focused on things that LGBTQ plus youth need in the state of Vermont. I also did work with Norwich University, if you're familiar with Norwich. I used to be a study abroad advisor there, but I also did some equity work with them and thinking about, like, what equity meant in their contexts. So I've done a lot of equity work statewide in a ton of different contexts. And I really appreciated that Agnes sent me a little bit of stuff about how you prep for the upcoming season, what it means to be a Vermont State Parks employee, what y'all get up to in a given day, and a little bit about where the parks are and what sorts of things that they do. So I have a little bit of background, but what we're going to do today is kind of combine our sets of expertise. I know a boatload about diversity, equity, inclusion. You know a boatload about Vermont State Parks, about the use of Vermont State Parks, about the differences between camping and day use, about what sorts of visitors you encounter and what they need and want from you. So we'll combine those kind of areas of expertise. And what I wanted to do just to start, if you wouldn't mind taking just a second in the chat, I'd love to know sort of when it comes to, like, diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, making sure more kinds of people feel treated well and feel like they belong in Vermont State Parks. What are some things that you came to the training today either hoping to learn or sort of wondering about? And it's okay if it's vague and non-specific, but it'd be really helpful for me, knowing your context, to understand, like, what did you come today maybe thinking that we would be talking about or hoping that we might cover? Go ahead and take a moment just to put those things in the chat. And I realize there are a bunch of you, so we'll take a second just to look. You know, I got all excited about that, and then I can't find the chat. Would anyone like to tell me the secret of where the chat in Microsoft Teams is located?
It should be located right across the top ribbon. There's going to be a comic strip bubble, and it's going to say chat right below it.
Interesting. I don't have that. Okay.
I can read them off to you if you would like.
That would be amazing. Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Sure. So from Ascutney, hold on, now a lot of things are coming in here. Let's see. From Ascutney, how can we increase diversity in our agency? Another one is recognition of historical land use and ongoing impact of state park land by Native Americans. Staff diversity. Best practice for inclusive communication. what park advertising looks like, accessibility in the parks when it comes to wheelchairs or crutches, because I understand the parks were built a long time ago
Mhm.
and there's not really many paths to lean-tos, tent sites, etc. What are some actions we can take at our level to make everyone feel welcomed and safe in the parks? Translating my knowledge of equity and inclusion in regards to educational programs into my work as a manager at the state park. Typical white family. How to make our waterfront more accessible to the disabled.
Mm.
Ensuring accessible spaces for people of all abilities. How to welcome and create interest for all groups to come to Vermont State Parks. Young LGBTQ members. Understanding how to have a healthy, inclusive environment for all staff and visitors. Some parks still don't have universal accessibility in the parks or bathroom shower facilities specifically. How do we respond to that
Mm.
and work around it as an important discussion to have?
I think that's a great foundation. Oh my gosh. Thank you, by the way, Ryan, for doing that. I so appreciate that. So what I can tell you is that it's about 9:12 now. We're not 9:12, 10:12 now. We're wrapping at 10:50, and we will have time to get to every single solitary one of these things, fix every single solitary one of them, go away completely not racist, and 100% ready to fix every problem in every park, right? Obviously not. This is really just going to be a moment more for us to raise questions, more for us to get to know what some of the challenges are. And then the opportunity becomes for you, the people who are most intimately familiar with the spaces, to think about what sorts of things can be done when it comes to actual physical park accessibility, when it comes to how we market and talk about the parks to people who may be visitors. A thing that I will tell you, putting it in context, is I'm also doing some work with the outreach team for Agency of Natural Resources. And we're going to be doing a lot of talking about how the marketing piece works and how we encourage people who may not usually be outdoor recreators, partially because of their identity stuff, to do some work in that direction. So I'm going to just start with a little bit of basics around why everybody doesn't just already use the park. And there are some things that I'm sure you're already quite familiar with here. So one thing that I heard come up all the time in that sort of list that I'm not surprised by, because the outdoors is inherently not an altered space until we alter it. And so it is inherently whatever accessibility it's going to be, right? If you imagine like Mount Everest has accessibility for a very specific like list of human beings and how they can physically interact with that space. So all kinds of natural spaces have different kinds of accessibility and different ways that people can physically engage. And it's up to us to think about ways that we can create opportunities for people with lots of differences to be able to engage with spaces. So accessibility as far as mobility, as far as maybe like hearing or vision impairments or any number of other things that challenge mobility or moving around is kind of an obvious one in parks, because it can be really clear, like, okay, well, mountain climbing definitely not an option for you in the same way if you are a person who uses a wheelchair. So what do we do in the park spaces? So accessibility for people who have maybe limited or different means is a really obvious one. Another one that's a little bit less obvious, I think, is the LGBTQ piece that came up, and then also racial and ethnic minorities and people who culturally didn't grow up exposed to parks. And I think that's one of the really valuable foundational things to understand about diversity, equity, and inclusion is it's not always just that the park space isn't made for particular kinds of people. because obviously nature's kind of made for humans, right? Like there's not a lot that makes an outdoor space itself inherently uninviting. A lot of what makes the challenge around creating diversity, equity, and inclusion is mostly the way that we humans have layered some of our biases that we don't even realize we have onto access of parks and onto the ways that people engage with parks. So I'm just going to ask if you sort of remember in the past couple years, does anyone remember any incidents that have been publicized around like outdoor spaces and people being like barred from them or discouraged from using them or yelled at for using them wrong, that seem to be more about identity than them actually using an outdoor space incorrectly? Does anyone recall any incidents like that? You can feel free to, if you're willing, you can feel free for a moment to unmute and say the thing, and then you can mute up again so we don't hear ambient noise. I heard buzzing, but then I didn't hear people.
My mute button.
What's that?
Yeah, Agnes, I think you're on mute now. For a second you weren't, but now you are.
There was a mention of the Central Park bird watching incident.
Okay. The Central Park bird watching incident.
Yep. Then there was also the filmed incident of a lady who called the police when there were persons of color having a barbecue in a public park.
Yes, the illegal being Black while in a public park situation. Absolutely. So we know of publicized situations where people's mere existence being different than maybe people anticipated for who would be taking advantage of that space, or how they expected those people to be taking advantage of that space, really interfered with the ability of those people to be in space. Now, one of the things that I want to raise, if we think about specifically the Central Park incident, in Central Park, what we're talking about is a bird watcher, right? A person who regularly interacts with the outdoors. And in that case has already already broken out of some of the shells that we sometimes find people kept back by. So sometimes folks who are city dwellers don't have a lot of exposure to the outdoors and don't have a lot of exposure to the idea of recreating in the outdoors. And so culturally, it can be less common for them to think of the outdoors as a place that they would want to go or that they could go. And historically, there have been times where we put actual legal limits on things. Like if you're Black, you have to leave this outdoor space by sundown, right? There were laws like that, especially in the South. Laws that said like people of color can come to this park, but you're going to have to go to the colored section of the lake and you're not going to be able to swim over here in the white section of the lake, right? So instances where our biases and even our official laws taught people of color or people of different cultural backgrounds that the outdoors either wasn't for them or that they were allowed to access it in a way that was defined for them. And that is a historical reality that's not even all that old, y'all. Like there are absolutely 100% folks who are still alive on the planet who were barred from particular swimming pools, barred from particular parks, barred from particular swimming holes, barred from being allowed to access a space, or at least maybe even being followed around in a space to see if they were going to do something nefarious or damaging, when all they really wanted to do was maybe barbecue or have a picnic or go canoeing or something like that. So all of those things are sort of coming together at the same time. We've got historical realities of people maybe even telling their own family members about a personal experience they had being limited in the way that they could recreate. We have a reality of like kind of cultural over time, especially like folks of color and LGBT folks kind of telling each other that it's not necessarily very safe to go into the outdoors because folks are coming for you, or that like people like us don't go do the outdoors. Let's go to the theater instead, or let's go to the basketball court instead, right? Like ways that people create community and connection and enjoy being out in the world that like they've come to culturally prefer because outdoor recreation maybe just wasn't a readily available option all the time. But in the situation with the Central Park bird watcher, he is a person who already had moved beyond the cultural reality that often a lot of Black folks don't go do outdoor recreation stuff, whether for cultural reasons or for feeling deterred. So we have someone who already moved past that and who was a regular bird watcher, right? So we might call that person an outdoor enthusiast, someone who's already choosing to engage with the outdoors. And in his situation, we have a run-in with another person who does not have a context for that kind of person engaging with the outdoors the way that they were doing it. And that is where our implicit biases jump in. So we have sort of some unconscious contexts in our head that basically tell us like, yeah, this is a thing I expect to see, not bothered by it, feel comfortable. Or this is a thing that seems weird to me. I'm not sure if it's okay. I'm not sure if we're going to be safe here. And even if we're going to be safe, I just want to make sure that whatever is happening isn't going to cause any trouble, right? A lot of that stuff is happening like in your brain without any of your conscious knowledge or intentionality attached to it. And so we sometimes have these situations where people react with, oh my gosh, what is this Black person doing in this park telling me what to do with my dog? Because that's what happened in that situation, right? Off-leash dog, and the person who was bird watching was concerned for his safety and whether it was a good idea for this dog to be off leash running around. And then the interaction that took place was two people in fear situations and the laws and the norms that came together around them in that situation. So that's kind of one example. The example of the public park situation is maybe folks that we don't know a lot about how they typically engage with the outdoors, how they typically recreate in space. What we know was that day they had elected to use an outdoor space to recreate and celebrate. And that means that they too had, of their own volition, come to the conclusion that the place they wanted to be was outdoors to do the celebrating and the recreating that they were going to do that day. And the run-in that happened there was, again, a person perceiving that these people enjoying the park in that way itself might have felt suspicious. And then we were asking questions about some safety things, right? In that situation, it was like, are you allowed to use a coal grill in this space? One of your jobs as a park employee is to think about what rules and guidelines exist in parks for how we protect the parks, for how we protect people in the parks. And our job is also to think about how we impart that information, how we educate on that information in a way that doesn't make people feel like they're not welcome or like they've transgressed in some way by trying to come into park space and enjoy it. So I wanted to provide some of those instances where we have a little bit of context already and that aren't Vermont related. So they don't feel like, oh, this is a situation that went south one time in my park. Just to give you some ideas about what some of those barriers are that people focus, the cultural reality of not being used to having access to outdoor land, or the historical reality of being pushed out or limited in use of space. And if we think about the LGBTQ situation, a reality for a lot of LGBTQ people is that outdoor spaces are sometimes places where this is actually the case also for specifically Black folks, are sometimes places where there aren't a lot of public eyes which is actually what a lot of people want when they're moving into outdoor space, right? Especially if they're going to go camping at a place that's a little bit more remote, or if they're going to take themselves out to the middle of a lake by themselves in their kayak. They may want a place where they feel like they can have some solitude, have some space, have no eyes on them. But for people who are used to the reality that when there aren't eyes on them, there's no one to witness whether they're safe or okay, it suddenly becomes a different question. So for a lot of LGBTQ folks and for a lot of specifically Black folks, outdoors is where violence has taken place. Outdoors, secluded, is a place where people take you to hurt you. And that creates a fear of a place, whether you've been to it or not. So I wanted to invite us all to recognize that there's a lot of reasons that people choose to engage with outdoor recreating space or choose not to. And there are a lot of like historical, cultural, in recent memory, in personal trauma history reasons that people think of different spaces as safe or not safe, or for them or not for them. So that's the baseline understanding. We're going to do a tiny bit of like kind of like vocabulary. What even is diversity, equity, inclusion? So I'm going to try to share my screen and we're going to see what happens, friends. Okay. Do you now see
We're getting a lot of yeses. I see your initials, but I also have a bad connection.
Yeah, I
So
can see it.
Agnes, it's up, but it looks like Mara's frozen.
Oh.
Sorry, Teams makes it very easy to inadvertently shut off the meeting. Not helpful. So basically just what I wanted to do was make sure that people could see the thing that I'm showing. So I'm going to share that screen again. And since it seems to be hard for me to navigate back to seeing you, if someone could just unmute and tell me if you are seeing, what you should see is like a bright yellow screen with primary colors that talks about diversity, equity, inclusion. So someone and tell me if that's what you're seeing in a moment here. That would be great. So are you now seeing those primary colors?
Now we're looking at your calendar.
Dang it! All right. Let's try this one more time. How about now? Anything? Still a calendar?
Looks good.
Yes! All right, go team. All right, so let's just dive into a little bit of parsing out. We're going to cover first equality, equity, and justice. For a long time, people sort of used equality and equity interchangeably, and I'd like for us all on this call to have a little bit more clarity on what the difference between equality and equity is. So first, some of you may have seen an image like this before, and some of you may not. If this is your first time seeing the image, let me tell you a little bit about what you're seeing here. They're demonstrating the difference between equality and equity. In the first image, what you can see is that what the youth in this picture want is to be able to see this baseball game. Now, in all of their cases, they by themselves are too small to see over the fence. So in the case of equality, equality, we give them all the same intervention to try to make it easier to see. What you can see for that first kid is that that intervention is perfect, and that kid can now see what they want to see of the baseball game. The kid in the red still has to stand on tiptoes. That kid can now see the game, but the intervention wasn't exactly quite what they needed to make it easy. They still had to go further to try and make it possible. And in the case of the kiddo in the yellow, you can see that the only reason they're able to see the game now is there happened to be a hole in the fence at the level where their box got them to. So the uneven ground, the uneven fence, the uneven barriers in the way mean that these kids needed different aids, different supports, different help to get to reach the same goal. And that is what equity is. So equity is that next picture that says, okay, the goal is, let's be able to overcome this barrier so that the kids can see the game. So in the first instance of the kid in blue, that one box was all that person ever needed. So the same intervention worked just fine here. For the other two kiddos, we needed a different intervention. For one of them, we needed 2 boxes. For one of them, we needed 3 boxes. And that helps us understand that the people who access something may require different things to make it possible for them to use the space or do the activity. So if I were to give an example, let's say a mobility question in parks. Some things that I see pretty commonly in park space are that we sometimes will create a space that's more flat, or we will grade something so that maybe someone who is ambulatory, like they can walk, but it maybe is just a little bit more of a struggle, they can still access that thing. But if we maybe leave that space in like natural floor, not like natural ground space, or we fill it with wood chips or something along those lines, while it might make it feasible for someone who has a walking mobility challenge, it may not be accessible for someone who needs to use a wheelchair. Maybe the path isn't quite wide enough for a wheelchair, or the stuff that we put on the ground isn't easy for a wheelchair to get over. And in that case, we need a slightly different intervention if we want those people to be able to also have equitable access. We're always going to be asking ourselves questions about like, hey, to what degree can we make this thing equitable and equal to access? To what degree can we invite people in? And to what degree do we have to accept that there may still be folks who can't enjoy something the same way? And what do we do for those folks in that situation? So equality, the same intervention to try to help people get better access, but different people need different stuff to get that access. Equity, finding the right intervention to help the person get access to the thing that they want to do or have or be or see. And I wanted to also introduce you to the concept of justice. Justice thinks about, well, wait a second, what if we removed the barrier in the first place so that we didn't actually need interventions to help people get over or around the barrier, and everybody could access the thing in more or less the same way because we removed the barrier in the first place? An abstract idea there that isn't really related to parks at all, but I think can be good for helping you crystallize what we mean there, is if you think about the school lunch system, the system that we originally had long ago was a child is responsible for bringing their own lunch to school, or whatever is offered is available to every child. Equality. But that didn't recognize the reality that if a slice of pizza was $3, some kiddos had more ability to get that slice of pizza than other kids did. And as we thought about oh, okay, the availability of food is different based on the economic capacity that you have, we started to develop programs like the free and reduced lunch program, where we said, okay, so that $3 piece of pizza might be feasible for some people to get access to, but that $3 might not be something that some families can reach. So in that case, maybe we have a reduced program where if you have this level of need, we make that piece of pizza $1.50. And then we recognize that there still may be people who don't have that access. And so if they meet a different threshold, we say, okay, your piece of pizza will be free. And we find ways to accommodate that on the side of the organization that's providing, instead of asking the people who are trying to access it to be the ones who figure out how to get over the barrier. Justice, a thing that you could think about, like, okay, what if we remove the barrier altogether, might be the idea of a universal school lunch program. So in that case, all food is made available to all children without any financial barrier at all. And so in that case, we don't just accommodate for the financial barrier, we remove the financial barrier. I'm not telling you, I don't want to like put in a value judgment that says any one of these ways is better than any other way, because we're not here to debate universal school lunches. I just wanted to offer you an example of what it looks like to give people equal access to everything. Everyone's welcome to buy their own lunch and bring it, or buy lunch here, but the prices are going to be the same. Equity, we create a graded program so that people with different access, with different means, can still have access to the same thing. And justice, we know what the thing is that everybody needs, and so we take down the barriers that would prevent people from reaching it. So that's kind of the difference there as we think about how do we create access? How do we invite people to take advantage of a thing, or to be able to take advantage of a thing? Next vocab words. Now we're going to talk a little bit about diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So I want you to think a little bit about park access here. And in this case, I can tell you, kind of based on some historical realities, where we have been over time. So there are some situations, not necessarily in Vermont, where we had rules that said some people are invited to a space and some people are not allowed to be there at all. So in racial history in the United States, we have sometimes said, if you are a person who is white, you can come to this park, or you can come to this lake, or you can come to this swimming pool. If you're a person who is Black, you cannot come here at all. You're not welcome. A next stage that we sometimes moved to was, okay, everybody should be allowed to have the thing, but they aren't going to be allowed to have it in the same way. So we're going to keep these people over here who are able to access the thing. And these other people can also have access, but it's going to be separate. And that might be one of those situations where we say, okay, fine. Black folks can come to this lake, but there's going to be a white swimming section and a Black swimming section. Integration happens when we say, okay, we're not going to have separate sections anymore. We're going to make it so that everybody can access this thing without limitations. That's what we call diversity, which basically is just that there aren't limits on who's allowed to come to the space or who can enjoy the activity. But what you can see there is that it often means that sometimes the group that was really often eliminated stays together in order to have some kind of protection, in order to feel like there are people who understand them, in order to feel like they belong, or maybe even because there's still fear that those other people don't want them in that space, or don't want them to be participating in the activity, and that they might not be safe. So diversity is a good thing. It recognizes there are lots of different people who may want to access a place or a thing, and it gives them initial access. It isn't the same, though, as inclusion. Inclusion is where we think about how we offer spaces, how we offer activities, how we invite people to a place, and think about ways that they can feel like they belong there, they matter there, and that there isn't a difference for them in how they get included in the activity. It looks kind of like a progression or an upgrade here, but the reality is getting from like the segregation part to the integration or diversity part is already hard. And then getting from diversity to inclusion is another really huge step. So I want to tell you a little bit about a good way that we see diversity or integration work that sometimes feels like we want to go further, but maybe we're just not there yet. So an example might be that maybe we have an affinity day of some kind at a park or in a space or at an activity. An example I can give you there is the Audubon provides pride hikes. So they are hikes that are explicitly open to LGBTQ people and their like friends, families, supporters, allies. And that space is a space where people who are LGBTQ can be together, can experience bird watching or hiking without having to have other people who don't necessarily understand their challenges, who don't necessarily understand their identities or experiences, or who oppose them in some way. It removes that barrier and creates a space of safety. So there is a role for affinity groups. Sometimes it feels like, wait a second, if we have a day that's explicitly for like people with mobility challenges to come experience state parks, isn't that going to mean that those people are separate and that they aren't really included in the rest of the population the same way? The answer might be yes, but for some of those people, that might be the entry that they need in order to be able to experience or enjoy something at all. A place that creates more safety or a place that just provides more supports. So for instance, if you think about sometimes there are like sensory days at different activities, especially indoor activities that are highly regimented. So I'm thinking about I used to volunteer at a sensory day for our symphony orchestra where I grew up. And the sensory day was a day where the lights were turned down a little bit more, where there were signs and indicators about what kinds of sounds might be going to happen, where there were spaces explicitly set for people to take a break, right? Things that recognized what some of the challenges to a traditional theater or symphony environment might be to someone with a sensory disorder and tried to manage for them so that they weren't left on their own trying to manage all of those pieces by themselves. And so, yeah, it meant that there ended up being a separate day that maybe most of the people who had sensory challenges chose to come that day and maybe not all the other days, but they got access at all and started to be exposed to the ideas and the processes and the experiences and the awesome things that could be had, right? So I just want to recognize that like diversity itself, that part where we get people into a space in the first place, or we recognize what might be necessary to help them come, might not be our end goal. If we think about inclusion, we might be thinking about what are the ways that we can provide access that means that more or less everybody can access this the same way and they don't have to feel separated. So an example there might be if you think about curbs on a street. If you are a person with a mobility challenge, stepping over a curb or rolling over a curb might be really not possible for you. But as we develop curb cuts, those little ramps in the sidewalk, we suddenly made it possible for people to use a sidewalk who before really couldn't. And so now everybody can use the sidewalk in more or less the same way because the thing that we created allowed those people to be included. Here's a really interesting part about inclusion, by the way, just like side note. It sometimes helps more people that you weren't thinking about helping. So in the example of curb cuts, actually, when the United States first developed those in cities, it turned out that it was a huge benefit to pregnant people and people who had new little kiddos in wheeled strollers, because before it was actually really hard for them to access sidewalk and walking spaces. So sometimes when we're trying to create inclusion, trying to create a way for people to equally access something, equitably access something, we actually end up catching more people in the scoop than not. In the long run, what we'd really love is to create belonging where people don't experience barriers, where they're involved in the park planning. All kinds of different people are involved in the new interventions that we're going to make, in the fundraising that we're doing, in the work that has to be done to maintain the park. And because those people are involved, the way we build the space, the way we build the rules, has all of these different needs included in it from the beginning, and people just belong. So that, my friends, is the basic vocab lesson. And we have just a few moments left. Are there any sort of questions that come up as we've had this very introductory lesson?
Just a quick reminder, if you guys would just make sure if you haven't signed the attendance sheet yet, sign that too while you guys are drumming up some questions.
I'd also like to just provide an invitation. Like I said, my name's Mara Iverson. My website is maraiverson.com, and there's contact information for me there. I'm so happy to do some talking to a particular site's staff about the really specific needs that are at your site. Like if your site doesn't have a swimming option, you do not need to talk about swimming accessibility, right? So if that's something like a question arises, or you'd like to have an opportunity to talk specifically about your context, that's an option that we have as well. Anything in the chat, people who can see the chat, since apparently Microsoft Teams and I are not best friends.
I'm not in the chat either, but this actually happened last year. Remember this was during COVID. We had an Asian family come to the park to camp. And after they set up, they needed some supplies, and went down the road about a mile to the nearest store to get some things, and they were refused service. So they came back to the park, and of course, we apologized profusely and sent them to another store. But certainly this didn't happen at the park, but reflects on the park and camping, and wondered how you would handle that situation.
That's a good question. Something just that I think about right off the bat is that I think that's an indicator of the fact that this diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, all of this stuff can't be contained to one area. So even if you're doing a really wicked, awesome job at your site, it absolutely will matter what roads people have access to drive to your site, right? And you don't have any control over that. That might be Department of Transportation. You have no control over the private stores or equipment providers that are nearby, and what they do and who they invite. I have personally been present in like a Camp General store where people mistreated the ever living hell out of a Hispanic family that were struggling really hard to try to do a transaction in English, but were there because they were getting ready to go off to their campsite, and they really were like all but abused. And the store wasn't related to the campsite. It's privately owned and operated. So the work that we do has to be everywhere. So when you get opportunities to have these conversations with other people in your circles, spreading the information and spreading the skills is how we make it so that places that you don't have control over are not making it harder for people to exist or making it harder for people to expose. in that kind of situation, sometimes in the moment, there's nothing you can really do but apologize and offer a support. Like, here's a store that we know the people who are there. In fact, we're even going to give a call ahead and say that you're coming so that we can tell our friend at the store that we're really excited that you're going to drop by there, and you can use relationship to create a bridge. I'm not saying that'll be a perfect solution, to be honest, because there may be ways that maybe that family would be like, no, we don't want you to have to call ahead to a store and warn them that we're coming, right? But providing a solution, and usually I think the thing to prioritize there is give the people who have been harmed the chance to say yes or no to whatever intervention you're offering, the chance to make choices for themselves. Don't do something for them that they haven't consented to. And then once you've had that experience, maybe think about how you can prevent future incidents like that. Like, maybe when people come around asking who to go to, maybe you don't direct them to that store, because you know that the likelihood that they'll have a painful experience is high enough that you're like, I can't control what painful experience you have, but I could recommend a place where I think it's less likely you'll have one. I think that's an awesome question to close with. And like I said, you're welcome to reach out at any time. And by the way, thank you for letting me talk to you today, because it made me so happy inside. All right, go make Vermont kick ass. Go do it. And obviously I can't actually dismiss you. I imagine that's something that's going to happen in the meeting.
Well, thank you so much, Mara. Super psyched that you were able to join us today, and thanks for this awesome training. I know this is something that, probably hit some spots for a lot of people today. So I do want to just relay again to folks, if you have interest in any sort of the work, the DEI work that we're doing here in the agency or within Vermont State Parks, please feel free to reach out to me at any point in time. And also, thank you, big kudos, Mara, again, for joining us today. I blew up the chat with a bunch of links and resources. We do also have a page on the staff website with other additional resources, so feel free to check that out as well, too. But thank you so much, Mara, and thanks everybody for being here and for participating. So see you in the next session, everyone. Thanks again, Mara.